right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Hawk Droppings. I'm recording this on Saturday, January 4th. Let's talk about the TikTok ban, that legislation in that case that is set for oral arguments this coming Friday, January 10th, in front of the United States Supreme Court at 9:30 in the morning. There's been a few things happening in that case, and what I want to talk about, well, so coincidentally, this coming Friday morning, when the TikTok ban arguments are going to be being heard in the United States Supreme Court, at that same time, Donald Trump is going to be appearing for sentencing on his criminal convictions in a Manhattan courtroom, 34 felony counts. And, you know, so we'll probably talk about that separately someplace else. I don't know. I appreciate everybody tuning in and listening to this and watching this. If you like our content, we're talking about the TikTok ban, and I have read the reply briefs from TikTok and from the government. That's what we're going to be talking about today. These are the final briefs to be filed by each side in that case. I don't know, frankly, what's going to happen with this case. I will be very curious to listen to the oral arguments this coming Friday morning. I don't have any sense of where the justices are going to land on this. I just don't know. So, but I'll think that through as I'm going through these. But what I wanted to walk you guys through today is the arguments that are being made by each side. Each side wrote a very good brief. One is the government, one is ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok. I'm going to start with the government's case first, because as we will see when we go through the brief for ByteDance, I think the government's brief is a bit weaker. It's got a bit less strength and heft and gravitas to it for reasons which we will talk about. So the case is TikTok and ByteDance versus Merrick Garland. That was joined with a case called Brian Firebaugh et al. Versus Merrick Garland. And the second case, I believe, was like 8 or 10 TikTok content creators who sued because they don't want TikTok to go away. At best, I think it's a 50-50 proposition at this point, whether or not the Supreme Court upholds this legislation and TikTok gets banned. What is the legislation? There was a bill, and okay, I'm going to put this down because I'm going to rant for a moment. Congress, the House and the Senate, passed a law that bans TikTok within the United States unless its parent company, ByteDance, divests itself of its ownership interest in the United States company known as TikTok. TikTok, as it operates in the United States, is an American company. It is just owned by a parent company which is based in China called ByteDance. And this legislation purports to seek to protect the 170 million Americans who use TikTok on a near daily basis. That's half the population. Half of the population of the United States uses this app. And our government, in a very heavily bipartisan manner, wants to take it away like that, which I think would have massive economic consequences for people who use the app, people who earn their money, earn their living from the app. I think it would have massive mental health consequences, negative, to people who this is how they socialize. They've built communities on this app. It will be unimaginably destructive if the government just does away with this app, TikTok. Now, let's talk about how the TikTok ban, this legislation, came to be. One thing that is not a part of the court record, and one thing that is not a part of any of the briefs from anybody that I've read in this case, it is It always has been and will always remain my firm belief that the reason this legislation came into existence and made its way through Congress so quickly is because of AIPAC. That is the American Israeli Political Action something committee. It is a lobbying group that lobbies the United States Congress on behalf of the government of Israel. Because, what did we see for the first 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months following the Israeli invasion into the Gaza Strip? We saw TikToks recorded by Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip showing what the Israeli government and what the Israeli military were doing inside the Gaza Strip. And before I go any further, because I know it is absolutely necessary, I'm going to add some disclaimers, which are disclaimers that I actually believe, but I have very much learned that if I don't say these things out loud at the very beginning, I will be referred to as pro-terrorism and anti-Semitic. I condemn Hamas. I condemn Hamas as a terrorist organization. I believe Hamas should be completely eradicated from the face of the earth. I condemn what Hamas did to Israelis and inside of Israel on October 7th of 2023. Conversely, I also condemn the treatment of Palestinian civilians, both inside the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and elsewhere, by the Israeli government and the Israeli military. Criticizing the Israeli government and the Israeli military and Israeli governmental policy is not the same thing as being anti-Semitic or just hating on Jewish people and the Jewish religion. We all clear on that? Good. There are no good guys here, except for the civilians on both sides. The Israeli civilians who were victimized by Hamas on October 7th, 2023, and the tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians, primarily women and children, who have been openly slaughtered by the Israeli government and the Israeli military inside the Gaza Strip over the last 14 or 15 months. The civilians are the ones that always pay the price on both sides. Now, why did I say all of that? Because at the time that this legislation came into being, we were seeing a lot of incredibly graphic footage on TikTok that was created inside the Gaza Strip by Palestinians. And I think his name is Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, was recorded on a conference call somewhere around that time, I don't know the exact date, saying, and the Anti-Defamation League is a organization with a tremendous history that fights anti-Semitism and Jewish hatred all around the world. They also have a huge presence here in the United States, and they work hand in glove with AIPAC, allegedly. AIPAC owns the United States Congress. But Jonathan Greenblatt was recorded on a telephone call just a few months into the Israeli assault into the Gaza Strip, saying we have a generational problem and we have a TikTok problem, because primarily college-age kids, people under the age of 30, were very pro-Palestinian as it relates to this conflict. And historically, I think that would be fair to say. And organizations like the ADL and AIPAC and members of Congress, you were equated, generally speaking, with being pro-terrorism and pro-Hamas over the last 14 or 15 months, and anti-Semitic, if you expressed any public support for Palestinian civilians. And I think that's disgusting. I think it is absolutely disgusting. To paint everybody who supports civilians not being slaughtered as being pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist, and anti-Semitic. And I have expressed the same level of support for Israeli civilians who experienced atrocities at the hands of Hamas on October 7th, 2023. I have expressed the same amount of outrage on their behalf as I have expressed on behalf of Palestinian civilians who have been slaughtered inside the Gaza Strip, and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands who have been displaced. And from what I'm seeing from recent reports, it's my understanding that the northern third of the Gaza Strip, the northern Gaza Strip, has been almost entirely depopulated. And Palestinians are not permitted to exist there anymore, and none do. They're just gone. And I'll leave it at that. So this piece of legislation that we're talking about that is the subject of this lawsuit, it was couched in terms of trying to combat or confront the fact that TikTok USA is a company that is an American company. It is owned all or in part, not all, but in part by its parent company, ByteDance, because one of Donald Trump's biggest donors, Jeffrey Yass, he's a hedge fund guy here in the United States, he owns a huge part of TikTok USA. But TikTok USA's parent company is a company called ByteDance, spelled BYTE, and that is a Chinese company, headquartered in China. And so the legislation is couched in terms of, well, they're a Chinese company, and under regulations from the current Chinese government, the People's Republic of China, communist government, even though there's not really that much communism there anymore, controls TikTok through ByteDance. And it poses a massive national security risk to American citizens because the parent company ByteDance is gathering all kinds of data and information on American citizens, and that information is being covertly accessed by the Chinese government for bad reasons, involving espionage and things like this. So that's the framework that this legislation exists within. China, bad guy, owns ByteDance, controls TikTok. Half of the United States population uses TikTok on a near daily basis. Therefore, the Chinese government is data harvesting all of this data on Americans for bad reasons, and in furtherance of espionage and things along those lines. That was the narrative surrounding this legislation as it made its way through Congress. If you know anything about the legislative progress or process in the United States Congress, stuff goes to the House, then it goes to the Senate, then it goes to the White House. Getting a piece of legislation passed can take years. It can take years and years and years of effort if you get it done at all. This piece of legislation was written and introduced into a committee in the House. 8 days later, it was signed into law by Joe Biden. 8 days. It was written, introduced into a committee in the House. It came out of committee, bipartisan, introduced on the floor of the House, passed overwhelmingly, bipartisan. Committee in the Senate, came out of committee in the Senate, bipartisan, introduced on the floor of the Senate, passed overwhelmingly bipartisan. Joe Biden signed it. That entire period of time was 8 days. Less than a week and a half. That is insane. And that happened at a period in time when TikTok was absolutely flooded with coverage of what was going on inside the Gaza Strip. And my belief, my personal belief, is that AIPAC absolutely flooded Congress with money in order to get this done, because they didn't like the coverage on TikTok of what the Israeli government and the Israeli military were doing inside of the Gaza Strip in their wholesale slaughter of Palestinian civilians, which continues to this day. Joe Biden announced yesterday another $8 billion arms sales package to the Israeli government and the Israeli military on his way out the fucking door. $8 billion. It's been going on for almost a year and a half. We do not have, nor do I think will we ever have, an accurate body count of Palestinian civilians killed inside the Gaza Strip, which again, somewhere between 60 to 70% of the Palestinians killed inside the Gaza Strip have been women and children, let alone elderly, teenagers, men who have nothing to do with Hamas. My personal belief, well, never mind. Let's let that slide for now. Okay, so let's get back to the briefs here. I'm going to start with the government's brief. And the government is very clear and very forceful in a couple of ways. The divestiture requirement, meaning that ByteDance has to sell its interest in TikTok, is entirely consistent with the First Amendment and with our nation's tradition of barring or restricting foreign control of communication channels and other critical infrastructure. In arguing otherwise, TikTok and ByteDance portray the legislation as an effort to suppress disfavored views. The legislation targets control by a foreign adversary, not protected speech. That seems pretty reasonable. TikTok and ByteDance object that the legislation is not sufficiently tailored, meaning narrow, because it singles out TikTok and because Congress purportedly failed to consider less restrictive alternatives, yada, yada, yada. So, well, let's just go on here. So I'm going to use the phrase called the act. When I say that, I'm referring to the legislation that was passed by Congress and signed by Joe Biden. And when I say petitioner, petitioner means TikTok and ByteDance. The act, okay, so TikTok's argument is that this legislation implicates the First Amendment, meaning this is a First Amendment case because the government is trying to restrict the speech of TikTok users within the United States. And at the Supreme Court, you have different levels of what's called scrutiny. And I guess the best analogy that I can think of is different levels of scrutiny. It's kind of like different burdens of proof when you're in court. The highest level of scrutiny at the Supreme Court is strict scrutiny, which is kind of like beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal court. Or you have intermediate scrutiny, which is a lower, it's kind of a lower burden of proof for the government, which would be kind of the more likely than not standard that you have in civil cases, where it's like got to be like 51%, whereas beyond a reasonable doubt is like this, more likely than not is like that kind of thing, you know. They spend a lot of time arguing about which level of scrutiny the Supreme Court should apply to this legislation in determining whether or not it's constitutional. If it actually does implicate or conflict with the First Amendment, it gets strict scrutiny, and the government's burden of proof is way up here. If the court doesn't think it does, then their burden of proof is kind of down here at intermediate scrutiny. Scrutiny is not a word. Sorry about that. The government's whole argument is that the legislation addresses conduct, not content. Content is speech. Content is what people make on TikTok when they make videos. That's content. That is speech. The government's argument, sorry, I got to shift positions a little bit. My leg's falling asleep. The government's argument is that this legislation is designed to address the conduct of the Chinese government in its partial ownership of ByteDance and its control of TikTok, its covert control of TikTok through ByteDance, the Chinese parent company. And the government is saying, we don't care what kind of content people put on TikTok. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter to us at all. We're not focused on content at all. We are focused on national security and the fact that the parent company is owned, the parent company is a Chinese company, and that the Chinese government has a partial ownership interest in that company, and through various regulations or whatever, controls what that company does, including what that company does with its subsidiary, TikTok USA, in the United States. That's the government's basic argument. They say it's national security. They say the Chinese government is using the data that TikTok is collecting on governments to build a massive database about Americans, and that will aid and assist them in recruiting spies in the United States, basically. Now, my initial impression of the government's brief is that it's a little too much. The government makes a lot of kind of self-serving assertions in this brief without seemingly backing it up with like actual evidence. I mean, they're kind of like, well, of course China is going to do these things. China is our enemy. China is our adversary. And of course, if they have the capability of doing these things, of course they're going to do that, is a big part of their argument. And I was reading through their brief a little bit, and I was kind of like, yeah, but you kind of have to show that they have done those things. Not just that they might do those things, or they have the capability to do these things, but haven't done these things yet. Because you are talking about speech. It's like, you know, I understand the national security, the foreign policy concerns. I understand that stuff. But you can't just simply ignore the practical fact that 170 million people in the United States of America, half of the population, uses this app on a near daily basis. Because it's like, when you're dealing with the law, you have what the code says, what the criminal code or the civil code says. You have what the statute says. And then you have real life. You have what's practical, okay? You have what's actually happening in the real world. And what's happening in the real world is that half of the population in the United States is using this app on an almost daily basis. I don't think that it's reasonable on the government side of things to just ignore that that's actually true. Hang on, I'm going to put another log on my fire here. Don't look at my butt. All right, we'll see how that catches. You know, you can't just pretend. You can't just pretend that there's 50 people in the United States using this app. it is used by half of the population. And the consequences of just yanking that out from underneath people, like that, you can't ignore that either. My fear is that this court will. So, how do I know the government has a weaker brief than TikTok does? Because frequently throughout the government's brief, they use words like clearly, plainly, obviously. And when you're legal writing and you're using those kinds of self-serving words, the other side has a better case. Well, obviously, national security concerns should trump everything. Plainly, we should protect the citizens of the United States from this foreign adversarial government. You know, when you're writing like that in a brief like this, you're fucking losing. And that's just the way it is. I mean, it's not a bad brief, but, you know, so the government's brief, I'll just sum it up this way. The government's brief focuses entirely on national security. And it says that the legislation, the act, is content neutral because we don't care what the content is. We care that TikTok, which is a United States company, we care that its parent company is in China and it collects data on the United States, and the Chinese government could do bad things with that data. They could do bad things with that data. And again, it's like the whole time I'm reading this brief, I'm like, okay, well, give me some evidence where they did. Give me some evidence where the Chinese government did. And they didn't provide that. Let's go through one section here. Even if TikTok had a cognizable First Amendment claim, okay, that's not the section I want to go through. There was a section. So they just spend a lot of time talking about what Congress wanted to do, what Congress was talking about, saying, because if the Supreme Court determines that the legislation does regulate content of creators, of Americans, that is regulating speech. And that absolutely pretty much requires that strict scrutiny, higher burden proof on the government. If the Supreme Court buys the government's argument that's like, no, we're not regulating the content or the speech of Americans, we are concerned about the conduct of the Chinese parent company, then that burden of proof comes down here to intermediate scrutiny. Jesus Christ, I can't pronounce those two words back to back. Strict scrutiny is easy. Intermediate scrutiny, which for some reason I want to pronounce as intermediary scrutinate. Okay. And so it's like the government spends a lot of time going through the intent of Congress in creating this legislation in that super short window of time that we talked about, like 2 days. And that they couch it almost entirely in terms of we're concerned about protecting American citizens from the nefarious motives of the Chinese Communist government. Which, it's like, how can you possibly be against that? You know? I mean, it's like after 9/11 happened, and it's like, how could you possibly be against wanting to catch terrorists? Yes, I know, we're going to pass this thing called the Patriot Act. We're going to take away a fuck ton of your constitutional rights under the Bill of Rights, but how could you possibly be against catching terrorists? The government's brief in this legislation is that kind of thing. It's couched in terms of, well, if you don't want this law to go into effect, then you must want China to win. It's a fucking... So here's the other thing. It's a fucking social media app. I use TikTok just as much as anybody, if not a little bit more. And again, I take privacy rights very seriously. especially as it relates to the United States government. But what is the Chinese government gathering information on me, like my route that I drive to work? Apple is collecting that information. They have Chinese subsidiaries. Facebook is probably collecting that. They have Chinese facilities, subsidiaries. And that's part of TikTok's argument that we're going to get to in a minute. It's like all of these other companies are doing the same shit, but you singled us out. You carved out exceptions for all of these other social media companies, even though bunches of them have Chinese subsidiaries which are regulated by the Chinese government. You gave those companies exemptions. We are the only company that is subject to this legislation. How is that fair? I think that's a reasonable question. I mean, they say the law is narrowly tailored, which is a requirement in free speech stuff, because, you know, I mean, what's the First Amendment say? The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law. Let me look up the exact language. I mean, so the First Amendment has like 5 components to it, and it's one sentence. A lot of people don't know that the First Amendment to the Constitution is one sentence. And it reads as follows. Okay, well, you know, it's like I thought if I would look it up on the interwebs, it would just give me the goddamn language. Hang on. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. What do people, and this is another argument from TikTok's brief. What do people use TikTok for? To speak, to express themselves. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Where on the internet do people express themselves and speak in the way that they do other than on TikTok? YouTube, I guess. That's close. That's an American company. But the entirety of the government's case in their brief is couched in terms of national security, and this doesn't affect the speech of Americans. We're trying to govern the conduct of a foreign country, a company that's located in a foreign country. The government completely ignores the practical terms. So I'm going to read the concluding paragraph from the government's brief, and then we're going to move on to TikTok's brief. Congress and the executive branch agree that the People's Republic of China's control of TikTok through ByteDance poses a profound national security threat. Well, that's nice. I'm glad that they agree on that. Are they going to give us any evidence of that? Is that true? Is it true that the People's Republic of China government has control of TikTok in the United States? Is that true? Because in reading their brief, I didn't see evidence of that. I saw allegations of that. And I need evidence. It's not me, being sympathetic to China or something. I understand that China is our adversary. They're our enemy. But if you're going to make that allegation, you're the United States fucking government. Give me evidence. If the evidence exists, I would expect the United States government to have that evidence. That evidence that the Chinese government is controlling TikTok in the United States, because TikTok in the United States is an American company. And this brief didn't contain that evidence. I'm just saying. it's a profound national security threat. As the Court of Appeals recognized, that concern is well-founded and not speculative. Okay, again, where's the evidence? And the act narrowly tailors that concern by requiring divestiture to sever foreign adversary control while allowing exactly the same speech on a post-divestiture TikTok. The First Amendment does not prohibit that critical step to protect our national security. I agree with that. If speech threatens our national security, there is a role for government, especially if that speech is coming from or influenced by or determined by a foreign entity. That gets a little murky as it relates to the First Amendment. I'm not saying it overrides the First Amendment, but it makes it a little tricky. It puts you into an arena where there needs to be some further analysis. I'll put it that way. Now, TikTok's brief. And here, so just like with the whole Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni thing, this is why it's important to wait for both sides to file their papers, kind of thing, I guess, even though that's a broad analogy. It's not specific to this. I'm going to read you the introduction to TikTok's brief because it's very good. The government runs away from what the DC Circuit Court held, adding new theories along the way, but it runs into problems just as bad, if not worse. The government begins by claiming the Act's TikTok-specific provision is subject to no First Amendment scrutiny at all, a position rejected by all three judges in the DC Circuit Court. It argues that ByteDance Limited has no rights at all because it's foreign, and TikTok Incorporated has no rights because it has no authority over the algorithm and the recommendation engine used on the U.S. platform, even though it's a U.S. company. That argument has no basis in law or fact and contradicts the government's concession that TikTok Incorporated is a bona fide American company. Indeed, the startling proposition that there should be no judicial scrutiny of a law shuttering a speech platform used by 170 million Americans would mean that Congress could ban petitioners from operating TikTok explicitly because they refuse to censor views that Congress disfavors or to promote views that Congress likes. And if accepted, this theory would strip First Amendment rights from any American speaker who publishes content that may reflect input from foreign entities or who is purportedly vulnerable to coercion from foreign entities, such as our new DNI Tulsi Gabbard. All of this is obviously wrong. The remaining threshold issue is whether strict or intermediate scrutiny applies. I got it right that time, almost. Plainly, the former, strict scrutiny. God, let me do that again because I got that wrong. The remaining threshold issue is whether strict scrutiny, the high standard, or intermediate scrutiny, the lower standard, applies. Plainly, the former, strict scrutiny. TikTok is arguing the law is about content, not conduct. The Act applies only to applications providing user-generated or user-shared content. It exempts a content-defined class of applications such as like e-commerce and singles out one content platform for uniquely harsh treatment, TikTok. The government, moreover, concedes that Congress did all of that based on concerns about the platform's content. Content requires the higher standard of review. I'm not going to get through all of this. Whatever, I'll abbreviate. And regardless, the TikTok-specific provision fails any form of heightened scrutiny. Yeah. Start with the covert content manipulation interest. Okay. Throughout the government's brief, they use that phrase, covert content manipulation, meaning that the Chinese government is manipulating TikTok content that is shown within the United States. The legislation doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't contain that language. And the government's briefs do not provide any evidence that the Chinese government has done that. They're saying, well, they could. They maybe have the capability of doing that. So because they might do that, we need to ban a social media app that is used by half of the United States population. I personally think that's bullshit. I like to see evidence of allegations. I don't like woulda, coulda, shoulda, maybe, possibly, who knows. I like to see evidence. And the government didn't provide any. So that's a problem. Congress didn't provide any. And I'll put it this way. This is how I know it was AIPAC, because AIPAC took advantage of the fact that ByteDance, TikTok USA's parent company, is a Chinese company. And the government of China regulates companies that are founded or operate within China. Weirdly, the United States government does that to companies that are founded or operate within the United States. Do they regulate them in the same way? Absolutely not. The Chinese government, especially under Xi, he's nearly a dictator, I think is accurate to say. And companies that operate within China are subject to different, and I would argue much more onerous regulations when it comes to things like intelligence or data than companies in the United States are. But look at what companies in the United States have done over the last 15 years. You look at Facebook, look at Twitter, look at Meta, look at Instagram, look at the data breaches, look at what Instagram and Facebook have done with their algorithms. Over the last 15 years, the suicide rate among teenage girls has doubled. And if you read any books by Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, he makes a very compelling argument that it's because of because of Instagram and its algorithms and what that does to the self-esteem of teenage girls, the things that they see on that app that they're comparing themselves to. Where is this grand act of Congress to deal with dead American teenage girls? Where is that? Where is that legislation? Look at the things that Facebook and Meta have done with our data and violated our privacy. I mean, fucking, oh God, what was the name of that company? Something Analytics. It started with a C, relative to the 2016 election. Facebook was responsible for a genocide in Myanmar. Where's that legislation? We don't get that legislation. We get this legislation because AIPAC doesn't like the coverage that's coming out of the Gaza Strip about what the Israeli military and the Israeli government are doing there. And TikTok's brief paints it squarely in practical First Amendment terms. Half of the population of the United States uses this app on a daily basis. And what do they use it for? Speech, self-expression. So, it's going to be an interesting day this coming Friday. First thing in the morning, East Coast time, is when the oral arguments are going to be heard on this legislation, the TikTok ban. And simultaneously, that is the same time, on the same day, that Donald Trump is going to be appearing for sentencing in a criminal court in Manhattan on 34 felony counts. So this week, is going to be a little bit of a ride, kids. And we've got confirmation hearings for Donald Trump's cabinet nominees. The House of Representatives has got to deal with the debt ceiling, reconciliation bill, funding Trump's deportation program and his tax cuts and all of that other crap. So it's going to be a busy week. It's going to be a busy 3 weeks between now and Inauguration Day. If you enjoyed this video, please consider going to YouTube and subscribing to our YouTube page. Just go to YouTube and type in Hawk Podcasts in the search bar. Our YouTube page will pop right up. I hope you enjoyed this episode by the fire. I very much enjoy my fireplace and building fires and having fires. Apart from that, it's about 2:30 in the afternoon West Coast time on Saturday, January 4th. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their weekend. Please have fun and please stay safe. I will see you next time. Thank you for everyone who subscribes. Thank you. I appreciate it.